Hey everyone, welcome to the channel and welcome to my first wrap up of 2023. So the stats have been reset, the goals have been made, and it's time for me to take a look back at what I read in January, which was a pretty heavy month in terms of review copies because the start of the year is absolutely awash with fantastic new releases. So I had a number of them that I wanted to get through. Some of those I'm still going on with in February, but let's go and have a look at how January's went. So as usual, I'm going to start off with the stats, and it's just one row of stats, or I guess two rows, but they are both the same because the year to date is of course the same as for the first month. So in January I read 3,788 pages, and because I only read 5 books, that gives me an average page count of 758. So I had some absolute chonkers to start off my year. The average rating though that I gave those 5 books was 4.3 because I had a really good January. So to quickly go through the series stats, I've started 3 out of the 5 books that I read. 3 of them were book 1 in a series that I'm going to be continuing with. There's no series that I finished or that I've decided not to continue with so far this year. And I'm up to date with 13 out of 30 series that I've got ongoing at the moment because I have reset the stats a little bit, removing some titles that I'd soft DNF'd in my most recent series recap. And then the last stat, as usual, is the day since the last 5-star read, which as of today, the day of filming, stands at 15 days. So for the books, I'll go through as usual in the order that I read them, but I will start off slightly out of order for that because I do also have, on top of those 5 books, I do also have a DNF. So the DNF doesn't count in my stats. The pages that I read before DNFing it, I do not include in my page count because I only record those for books that I've finished. So I did start The Faded Dragon by Cameron Michaels. This was another review copy for a book that comes out, I think it's the 4th of February. This one has an interesting cover, it's got an interesting concept. I did obviously pick it up to read because I was genuinely interested in reading it, but I decided to put it down after 22% because I realised at that time, although the pages were turning quite quickly for me, I did get to 22% in a couple of days. I wasn't really invested in it. I didn't have any connection to the characters or what was going on, the world, or anything along those lines. So I did decide kind of on the cuff that I'm going to try to be a bit less stubborn in my reading this year. So if I do have a book that I'm not getting on with and I'm not enjoying it so much as I'm reading it, I'm going to try and put more of those books down. Whereas usually, because I am quite stubborn with these things, I'll continue reading and get to the end of it regardless. So this was my first DNF of the year. I only DNF'd 2 books last year. I've got no targets because obviously I want to enjoy and therefore finish every book that I read. But starting off the year with 1 DNF, and that was for The Faded Dragon. So then on to the books that I did finish, and we start with a big chunky 800 page book, The 11th Cycle, or just 11th Cycle, I do apologise, by Kian N. Ardle. And this is book 1 in his new Mistland series, which is, I've never played the games or read the manga or anything like that, but apparently this is Dark Souls and Berserk inspired. I can't attest to that because I don't have those experiences, but what I can say is this was a very kind of strange but enjoyable book. I say strange in that it was a really difficult one for me to review because there are a lot of hard, heavy-hitting themes in this book. There is in the foreword, they're not specifically labelled as such, but in the foreword at the start of the book, there are trigger warnings or content warnings for you to be aware of. There is a lot not to like in this book. So it was very strange to review because there were all these themes that I did not get on with, that I didn't particularly like, but overall the book itself I did like. It was very odd. And I know at least part of the reason for that was because I listened to this. Although I've got this beautiful review copy, I do also have a review copy of the audiobook as well. And it was a great audio. It's a dual narration. There are 5 POVs in here. 2, let's call them 2 male, 2 female, and then there's a 5th POV in there as well for a genderless kind of being within this particular world. And the audio has two narrators, and I really liked both of them. I thought they did a great job amongst the Gamuta voices that they were asked to portray. So really good audio. The writing in here, if you take out the themes that I didn't like, the rest of it, the action scenes, the character development, the various elements of world building and plot, I really enjoyed. So it's a definite recommendation, but especially because it is quite chunky. I know various people will prefer to try out the audio, and if you do, you can have a great time with it. I gave this one in the end 4.5 stars, which was a great start to my year. So my second book and my second review copy for 2023 was No Heart for a Thief by James Lloyd Dulin. Again, this is one that I was drawn to by the cover and synopsis combination. And this one, again, was one that I had a good time with. It was a very different book to what I was expecting, because from the synopsis, I was essentially expecting kind of one story, but I kind of got two, because as well as the story I was expecting, the one that was pretty much signposted on the synopsis, there was a kind of back in the day story as well. There was one of the characters telling his story. So from the synopsis, you know you've got an older and a younger character, and it's basically the older character telling his story of how he came to be where he is. All told, this was a book with some really interesting magic that I definitely got on with. It had good world building, the characters were quite interesting. We spend a lot of time with one of the characters because he's in both of those stories, and the secondary character, not so much time with, but there are various other characters introduced as well, and I think they all worked quite well for what we saw of them. I like that this book didn't kind of give you everything on a plate. It made you work for it, it made you wait for it a little bit, so it'd give you little snippets. So you were interested, you could kind of work out, for instance, how the magic worked, or kind of put your thoughts together as to how you think it works. And then later on in the book, it would just give you a bit more information so you could develop those theories and eventually figure it all out for yourself. And I like the way it did that, because sometimes it doesn't work where you do that and you end up with too many unanswered questions, but that wasn't the case here. I did have a good time overall with this one, even though it wasn't quite what I expected with that kind of split storyline. I'm definitely excited for the second book in the series, the Mela 2. I think it's a trilogy, and the way that this one finished, it does give, I think, a pretty clear path as to what the story, or the opening of the story at least, is going to be for book 2 when it does come out. So this one I gave 4 stars to. It was definitely a good start to the series, and yeah, as I say, I'm looking forward to continuing and seeing what the author has got next for us. Third book I read in January was another audiobook. This is one that my patrons picked out for me, and I can't remember what 2 options I gave them that they didn't select, but they did end up going with Blackstone Heart by Michael R. Fletcher. And this was a bit of an odd one for me. It had, again, some themes that, not necessarily themes that I didn't get on with. It didn't have the sort of real heavy themes that 11th Cycle had, but it did have some interesting and maybe a little bit weird and wonderful stuff in here. We've got necromancy and all sorts of things that go along with that. And yeah, some of it was a little bit weird with the way the main character interacts with some of the others in here. The narration of this one I thought was pretty cool. It was narrated by the author himself, so I kind of like that, because obviously there's no interpretation of a narrator. The author knows what he was intending as he was writing it, so he knows the correct intonation to use. He knows the pronunciation that he had in mind, of course, for things like characters and places and stuff like that. So I do think that as long as the narrator, as long as the author has got the, I guess, range of voices, that it's really good to have that. And I think Michael R. Fletcher did a pretty good job here. It was kind of a low, almost growly, not quite gravelly voice, but I think it worked well. After I initially got used to it, I think it worked really well for the main character. The overall story was a bit strange, because it was one of these ones where, again, you're trying to piece it together as you go, but it's kind of as the character pieces it together as well. So in that sense, it definitely works. Again, it's one that I'm interested in the ending. There were some nice little reveals at the end, which I think worked quite well. And I'm definitely interested to see how the story plays out now that the characters got that additional knowledge. So yeah, a good time overall with this one, even though it was in places a little bit different to what I was expecting. I've heard people call this a romantic grimdark comedy or something along those lines. Not so much the comedy, I don't think, and not so much the romance, but at the same time, I can kind of see where they're getting those words from. So yeah, it was a nice, pleasant surprise. I'm glad that I enjoyed it because I do have a second one on my shelf as well, and this one ended up with 4 stars. The next review copy I read was another big chunker. This is Age of All Sin by Daniel T. Jackson. So this is book 2 in the Illborn saga. I really enjoyed Illborn. It was one of my 5-star reads in November 2021 when I read it, and I was really looking forward to this one because obviously I had a good time with the first book in the series. So this one, despite everything I knew from Illborn and everything I was expecting from this book, I don't think it's really exaggerating to say that it blew me away. I say a lot that I really liked a book because I really like reading, and there's a lot of books that I really like. I can't say that about this one. I loved this book. It just hit every single marker that I want from a book of this type. It was kind of weird for me because I said that I enjoyed Illborn so much. It scored, I think it was 80% in my weighted ratings. So obviously there's some room for improvement, and a lot of that is with it being a first book in the series. You've got the characters and the world especially to develop over the course of a few books. So I didn't think it was possible for this book to improve on Illborn as much as it did. There is not so much a gap, there's almost a gulf between the two books for me, which is really strange considering how much I enjoyed Illborn. It's not a case of book 1 wasn't really very good, but book 2 did hit the mark. Book 1 already hit the mark. This one far surpassed it. So I think people who've been on my Discord or patrons who've listened to me talking about it in my updates are probably a bit fed up of me saying how much I enjoyed this, but I love how intense this book was from really early on, right up until the last page. It just gripped me and didn't let go. There were some great characters, including a kind of 5th character, because this is a 4-person POV, but there's another character who kind of joins in, who we know briefly from a little cameo in book 1, and he became part of the main story, kind of a secondary character rather than one of the POV characters. And I loved that addition. I think it worked really well and gave us some interesting elements, as well as giving the characters themselves access to a lot more information. So that definitely helped with the story development as well. So overall, this was absolutely excellent. I really had a good time with it. I'll stop talking about it now because people are probably fed up with me saying it, except to say that, of course, if you haven't guessed it already, I gave this one 5 stars. And then the last book that I read in January did take me a little bit longer because it was a big chunky thing of something like 1,400, nearly 1,500 pages. This was, of course, Of War and Ruin by Ryan Cahill, book 3 of The Bound and the Broken. And a bit like 11th Cycle, this is a difficult one for me to review, but for very different reasons. First of all, I had a really good time with most of the aspects of this book. I've loved this series and kind of not growing up, but watching, I guess, the characters as they develop. And I've really enjoyed that. The story, the world, characters, the plot, everything in this series really speaks to me and tells me this is what you want to read. So I was obviously really looking forward to this one. The previous 2 books in the series, I gave both of them 5 stars, as I did to The Exile, which is an excellent novella coming in between book 2 and this one. Sadly, I didn't enjoy Of War and Ruin quite as much, and there's a couple of reasons for it, but the main one, for me at least, it was just too long. There are books that I feel like I could just carry on reading because I'm having such a good time with them. Age of All Sin being a really good example. Finishing that book, I feel like I could have asked for another couple of 100 pages and still enjoyed them as much as I did, but the book stopped where it did, and it's probably a good thing because it was the right place to stop. Now, I'm not saying that the right place was missed in Of War and Ruin, but I did feel like as I was in the kind of the home stretch, the last 20-25% of this book, it did start to drag a little bit for me because I'd been reading it for so long. It just kept going on, and it seemed at times like there was no end in sight. And obviously, if I'm enjoying a book in a series and an author, that's not a good thing to be saying. It's not what I want to be saying. But yeah, for me, it just was too long. I said in my weekly video that I do for my top tier patrons that it was a bit like the TV series, and specifically I used the example of The Walking Dead. So I really enjoyed The Walking Dead to start off with. It had some great characters, great scenes in it, some great action, an interesting world, and it was something that I was really invested in, both the plot and the characters. But it went on for like 10 seasons, and for me, I feel like it should have stopped at 6. It should have been written to a close at that point, and everything that happened afterwards was not quite the same, but not really too different either. And for me, it just lost its spark. And that's exactly what I felt with Of War and Ruin. It just went on too long, and there were just too many elements that, because of that, I feel just lost their spark for me. The other main thing that I didn't like in this one was some of the characters, or not necessarily the characters themselves, but the character changes. So prime example is Belina, who I did quite like in the previous books, but especially in the novella The Exile, short book rather than a novella. I really enjoyed her character. I thought she was really cool and really fun to read. And in this book, she kind of turned completely around for me. I didn't like her at all. And a large part of that was because it was almost like she was written to be really cool. And instead of her earlier snarkiness that I really got on with, here it was more that she would just, whatever she was saying, she would just sprinkle in both male and female body parts like it was cool. And it just made her sound a bit like a 13-year-old boy who's just getting to know what these terms are and what they mean in the wider scale of things. So it was disappointing for me in that respect because it made a really good, really interesting character just really not interesting for me. So anyway, this was a really odd one. As I said, it was like 11th Cycle in that it was really difficult for me to review, because what stays with me, certainly after having it finished for a week or so at this point, what really stays with me is the negative, and that will fade over time and will probably improve my kind of perception of the book. But at the moment, it does seem like I'm only focusing on the negative, which means that it's really strange that I still understand that I did, in the main, with those bits aside, have a good time with this book, and I still did enjoy it and still enjoy the series overall and look forward to the next one. I gave it 4 stars, which sounds really impressive because of that focus on the negatives, but I think that just shows that the base that this book had to build on was really solid in the first place, and most of the work that it did was really good work, with again some great action, some great intensity, some good character development and all of those things. And it was overall an enjoyable experience, at least up until the point where I feel like it should have been written to a close a little bit earlier. So anyway, there we go. That's 5 books finished for 758 pages. I don't think I'll have another month quite like that one, at least for a good long time. I do have some shorter books lined up for February and the months ahead, but of course there are also some big chunkers left this year for me as well. Let me know in the comments down below if you've read any of these titles and what you thought, and also how did your first month's reading go in 2023? What was your favourite book that you read in January? If you want to connect with me elsewhere, check out the links to all my social media down in the description box below this video. You'll also find there links to my book club Discord, where we've got a nice active community to chat with on anything fantasy and just general, I guess, as well. And also, if you're interested in supporting the channel in another way and getting access to those weekly video updates where I talk about just general things, but also my feelings on books as I'm reading them, you can also find the link to my Patreon down there as well. That's everything for today. Thank you for spending your time with me. I'll hopefully catch you in the next one sometime soon, but until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye for now.